All right, me. It is the very 1st of December. It is the Sunday of Thanksgiving break. I go back to school tomorrow, but I finished reading Terminal, which is the 6th and final book in the Tunnel series by Roderick and Brian Williams. Whew, boy, what an ending! What an ending to all of this. I don't even know where to start. I really don't, because it feels so much like oh shoot, we gotta wrap all this up, and this has to be the last book, so we're just gonna pile everything we can into this to try and make some sort of sense out of this, right? God, it's just so, like, the entire time of reading this, I could not stop laughing. And not because it's actually funny, or it's like, it's trying to take itself so seriously in a way that, like, just doesn't make any sense with the way that these books have been going, right? And to me, this is like a commentary on the series as a whole, right? But it starts off with a nice idea of, like, okay, we're going to explore one of these original early concepts of the way that the world worked, and then we're going to go from there, right? And so that's taking the hollow earth theory and then compounding it and exploring it and going from there, which is a solid enough idea. You know, the characters, especially our main character Will, I never really liked, but, you know, solid enough idea. But then you just keep compounding and compounding and compounding all of these things. You know, you bring in this whole idea that there's now another world that exists underneath. Okay, fair enough. And then you bring in this higher race that exists, but it turns out to be an entirely different species that exists. That is going on. You bring in, early on, you bring in the idea of Atlantis, and you bring it up again a few times in other books, and then you bring in ley lines and the concepts of holy places and things, and it's like, you're just compounding so many things that everything loses all of its meaning. And so instead of exploring this world, it's like you're forced to come up with some sort of reasonable explanation for everything, right? Which is, I think, one of these really, really hard things when it comes to writing a series, right? Especially a series in which, because of how long it is, you have to keep people's attention in it, right? When it comes to, like, some other, you know, children's, you know, middle school, early high school pieces of like series like this, and you know, you think Harry Potter, you think Percy Jackson, you to an extent think the Hunger Games, but, like, you know, within all of those series, specifically the first two, Harry Potter and Percy Jackson, right? In one of them, you're building off basically a very small idea, and then you get to explore it in whatever way that you want, and anything that doesn't make sense, you get to explain away with magic, right? In the other world, right, you're building on this incredibly rich history of folklore and mythology that exists already, and then you're compiling it and shifting it a little bit and building on top of that, right? Versus here within Terminal, in which you've taken a whole bunch of different ideas and then compiled them and just compounded them. And because of that, like, it just doesn't react. And so, like, you're just having to build and build and build and build and build. But yeah. God, this book specifically, part of it is just like, because there are so many things going on, right? We've gone past the point of where I talked about this with some of the very early books of like, yeah, you know, it's always interesting when you have, you know, multiple authors or a long-standing series like this that you get to have the opportunity to explore some other characters' perspectives and like what they're doing at the same time instead of just following one character all the way throughout, right? That's an interesting concept. The problem is that you get to this point in the series in which you're scrambling to figure out everything and put everything together in its place, and then all of a sudden there's too many perspectives, and like, you know, you're constantly having to bounce and bounce and bounce and bounce. But like in this book, there's Will, there's Elliot, there's Drake, there's Jigs, there's Chester, there's Martha, there's Stephanie, there's Perry, there's Eddie we get for a little bit, I think. So like, and then like, oh God, there's, and then I think we even see from Rebecca at some point, I think we see from Danforth, right? There's like 12, 13 characters that we're like all reading from in this 400-page book, which means that sometimes we go back to these characters that we haven't seen or heard from this character in a book and a half. Why are we going back to them? Why does this matter? Right? So yeah, right. It's overcomplicating things, and then combined with that, you have this constant thing that was happening throughout the other books, and I touched on this as well. But like the feeling of like the constant need for like twists and turns and things, and like nothing is ever as it seems, right? And you take this character in Chester, which I still argue is by far the most interesting character throughout this entire series, and then you give him such a non-ending because of a twist to set up a twist, right? Because now you've decided that this whole thing that Chester went through in the previous book, in which the entire faction that he's working with gets turned on by Danforth, and then in Danforth's leaving ends up killing both of his parents, right? And so Chester, who has been through the first four and a half books, really the first 4 books I should say, all with the intent of like, he's just trying to get back to his family, get back to some sort of normalcy, and then when he finally gets there, it's taken away from him. That's a fantastic, interesting character, and that gives that character something very, very, like, that's probably the most unique character in all of this. And then we get part of the way through this book, and Chester's, you know, finally he's starting to recover, he's starting to work through the stages of grief. And then, oh yeah, turns out that was all planned, and Danforth is actually an inside man who's a spy, who his leaving became way greater than it was. And so now you have Chester, who decides to turn his back onto the people who have protected him and who at this point have protected him and guided him through life. And then suddenly Martha shows up back out of nowhere. Martha the cannibal that was kidnapping Chester, right? All of a sudden comes back out of nowhere, right? And it's just another one of these things of where it's like, just let a character die or let a character live, right? Let a character, explore a character, right? Because it's finally getting to the point of where, like, you know, through 5.5 books, Chester has been this character that's had this really, really interesting story and interesting motivations, but it's always someone else that does all the driving of it, right? And we're finally about to get to the point of where Chester's finally going to do something on his own, and then all of a sudden there's this character that we had written off 2 books ago. Yeah, right. And it's like, it's just such a non-ending, and doesn't, and then, you know, the whole thing at the end where he's chasing down Danforth, all of a sudden Chester shows up as Danforth's about to do something, and then Chester gets shot by Martha, and then that's that, right? And like, it's just such a poor ending for what is arguably the best character in this entire series, right? It's just so disappointing. You know, and then you have the whole thing with Drake, and that Drake somehow managed to survive point blank thermonuclear detonation, and has managed to live like 3 weeks afterwards, while running around in the inner Earth as well as then on the outer Earth, and then dies very specifically at the very end, right? And it's just like, it's so, none of this matters anymore, right? They're just so non-entities, because it just doesn't make any sort of cohesiveness to it all. God, and then you have, you know, I'm trying to think of all these other side characters in it before we get to the fucking big one. Yeah, right, like, it's just so much of it is just like so blasé, right? It's just so and then, God, you get to, I'll talk about the big one here, all right, of, we finally get through all of this, and we get to this whole thing with the Bushmen, and with the with who Elliot really is and what the Sticks really are, right? And it's just so like, here's a group of people that we introduced 3 books ago, and we talked about them for like 2 chapters, and then we never brought them up again, all right? And we never talked about them, and then it turns out, oh yeah, by the way, they're actually what humans really are, right? The Bushmen, and that they look like trees because they developed this very hard external epidermic layer, to protect against the constant sun that exists in the inner world, right? It's just like, so it's another one of those things where like, it feels like you just that this book is just having to go and backtrack through everything and solve everything again, like just so many things that were just kind of left beforehand. So yeah, that was, yeah, just like, it just felt weird. And then, as it turns out, the way this all worked is the Bushmen are actually real humans, and it turns out that the Sticks are a race of aliens that have existed, and that the Earth is actually a spaceship, and the Sticks got lost on the way home, and then stopped. Atmosphere leaked out of the inner Earth to the outer Earth, and then something happened, I guess, I don't know, but then the humans ended up moving to the surface of the Earth, while the Sticks remained in the center of the Earth, but then moved up a couple layers, but not all the way to the top. And then this just kept going on and on and on until they eventually just forgot what they were supposed to be and everything, right? And it's just so like, what a way to end this, right? That you've given us 6 books of a terrible main character in Will, who is just so self-centered and so annoying in a way that is so hard to understand and so non-enjoyable to read, only for us to finally get to, oh yeah, by the way, we're actually these are all aliens. Surprise. None of this gets mentioned till this very end. You know, even within like the things that they go back to and whatnot, right? All the description that gets told about like, oh, you know, here's a little bit of foreshadowing, here's a little bit of expectation of what we're getting at, doesn't occur until this last book and a half. Because as it was written in the acknowledgements for the previous book, it's like, yeah, I guess I didn't really think about what the sticks really are. You know, are they really human? And so it's just like, why? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't. God. Yeah. And then, you know, even our main character Will's ending is just such a non-ending. Elliot's ending, who's another one of these really interesting characters. You know, she's dealing with the fact that, you know, young, from the start, young girl that is forced into a position of leadership against her will, when what she would love to be able to do is just do her own thing. And then turns out that she is, you know, part of this half race, and is dealing with feeling a loneliness and pushed out by both sides of the party. And so, like, what you're dealing with is really interesting character, and then it just kind of becomes, yeah, no, she does this great sacrifice, and it's great and it's wonderful and it makes a lot of sense, but then now she's just in the center of the earth, completely alone. So yeah, it's just another one of these like, and then Will's ending, where it turns out that because he got some larvae in him for a little bit, right before Elliot did her thing and destroyed everything, or moved all of the sticks back to the center of the earth, and it turns out that Will's becoming a Styx all of a sudden. His, I guess, genetics are changing. God. So, that's another just one of these, like, oh, it's just kind of non-ending, right? It exists, sure, and like, I guess it is an ending, but like, all of this really seems to me, as is noted by the acknowledgements in the very end, of where Roderick Gordon is talking to his editor, and he's like, or his publisher and editor, we finally did it. We got there. Now where's that film you promised? Right? This entire ending to this book specifically, as well as the scene, there's a lot of the scenes in the previous book, feel so much like trying to build up to like franchising this and like building this out into this really, really massive thing. And then it just never got there. Right? So yeah, I don't know. The series as a whole, did I like the series a lot? No. I was not a huge fan of the series. I think that there's some really, really interesting characters in there. But like, as a whole, it's just not the most enjoyable, right? And I recognize that this is not built for me, right? I'm not the age at which, you know, this is intended to be read by, and, you know, all of this stuff. And I get that, and I do appreciate that. However, I think one of the marks of, like, you know, something that even you decide to franchise out, or like, you know, you take literature and you turn it into profit rather than literature for literature's sake and whatnot. And, you know, you have all these other things in there, but I think what makes those things successful is always that even if they're intended for a younger audience, you can read them at an older age and still get something from them. Or if you're looking at something that is intended for a much older, mature, you know, intelligent audience, that there's still something there that can be adapted pretty easily. easily to fit for someone who may not be that, right? So yeah, that's the Tunnel series. It's finally over. Shout out to the Chicken House. They sure do love their certain books. But yeah, that's Terminal, the last one in the book, the last one in the series.